I'm gonna, one sec. There. All right, everybody. Yeah, here we go. So I posted this little artistic representation of Hosea. I thought was a pretty descriptive picture of what we're about to read. And we really do kind of jump right into pretty graphic and powerful story of Hosea. And as people come in and as people start to get settled into this new book and this new phase of what we're studying, today we start our first of what are called the minor prophets. And this prophet is actually, Hosea is actually in a couple of the Haftarot. So welcome everybody. I'm kind of giving everybody a chance to jump on. We're a great online audience here today. The minor prophets are called the minor prophets, not because they're not important, but because they're not nearly as long, right? And if you add up the 12 minor prophets together, they're not as large of a text as Ezekiel. They're not as large as Isaiah. They're not as large as Jeremiah. So we're in a whole different sphere now when we get into these minor prophets. Actually, I'll show you something that I use. I find it to be an interesting resource when I'm trying to figure out, when I'm actually planning out our classes to try to estimate how much we're going to be reading. I'll show you something that I look at. It's not something that Jews really look at because we're not into chapters and verses usually, or we weren't. But this is an interesting statistic thing that I found. These are based on the Catholic organization of the Bible, which is different than the Protestant and obviously different than the Jewish. But what's interesting about it is there's a lot of overlap, a lot of similarity. But what it does is it shows that how many chapters there are of each book, with also the average verses per chapter. And it shows you, of course, somebody did this, like nowadays, somebody did it. I'm glad I didn't have to do it. But it's very simple. They did a chart. So there's the 5 books of the Torah. You can see it. You can see which is longest by verses, which is longest by chapters, because sometimes they're not. Sometimes each chapter is not very long. Numbers is only 36 chapters, but it's 1,289 verses, which is more verses than Exodus has. So, these statistics are kind of interesting, especially when we're planning stuff out. But like, for example, this has books of the pseudepigrapha and the apocrypha that we don't have. But thankfully the church kept them, like the books of the Maccabees. But it's organized in a slightly different way. But here you can see, for example, our prophets are listed with Baruch, which is also in the apocrypha, and the book of Daniel, which is part of Ketuvim, but they put them together with these other prophets. Here's Isaiah, Jeremiah, and they put Lamentations, which according to tradition, according to our tradition, was written by Jeremiah. But that is in our scrolls. That's one of the Megillot, for the one for Tisha B'Av, and that's in the Ketuvim. And they put it together with their prophets. But if you see Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, you can see there that Ezekiel was 1,271 verses, which was almost as many verses as Isaiah was at 66 chapters. So it kind of helped me a little bit, plan out, But if you look at the minor prophets, if you look at these prophets, again, you have Hosea, which is the longest one. Amos is pretty long. Zechariah is pretty long. But, the total number of verses is only 211. And this one, Hosea, one we're reading right now, is only 200. But it's the largest one, and it's still just a fraction of Ezekiel. You know, it's 1/6 as many verses as Ezekiel. So it's a lot shorter, and all of these things added up. All right, if we added up all of these from here to here, it still doesn't give us as much as we have in Jeremiah and Isaiah. So that's why these books that we read were so long, so really like almost a different genre of literature, even though they're all prophetic. The length the amount of material, textual material, is just so much bigger. What's also interesting, I mean, in some cases like Isaiah, you know, we pretty much identified, agree that there's at least 2, possibly even 3 Isaiahs. We don't believe there's more than one Hosea. Most of these other prophets, we kind of, they're almost too short for them to have been compilations of things. But in Hosea, we actually do get some interesting textual questions, which we'll discuss. Actually, I might mention them right off the bat. But yeah, all of these minor prophets, we call them minor prophets, and the Notzrim, the Christians, also call them minor prophets. But again, depending on the prophet, some of them are studied a little bit more than others. Jonah, for example, we study a lot more because it's it's what we read for Yom Kippur. It's a story that captivated people's memory and attention. So that is one of the books we're going to be reading as part of these. But some of these we're going to do in one day. In one day, we will. I mean, Jonah, we might not, because we always rush through Jonah at Yom Kippur. We might spend a little bit more time, even though it's only 4 chapters. Maybe we'll read it over 2 weeks, just depending on what happens. But yeah, some of these for sure. I mean, Obadiah is 1 chapter, and we'll read that at least with one other thing, as we go through these things. But Hosea, we're going to read it probably over 3 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, depending on how many verses we get to today. But some of the verses are very short. I mean, chapter 3 is 5 verses. Chapter 6 is 11. Hosea, we'll talk about now, is an interesting prophet. We're going to definitely read the first 3 chapters, which is 1 unit. It's the most famous part of Hosea. But we read Hosea frequently. Hosea as a prophet is read a few times during the year as part of the Haftarot, as part of the sections of the prophets that we read on Shabbat. And so Hosea gets a little bit more reading than others. He also, as we're going to see, his story is captivating and troubling, and is very unusual. So unusual that some people said it didn't happen because it's so outrageous. But good morning. It's not like the other books to some extent, because and we're going to take a look at it right now, of who Hosea was. Hosea, and we're going to flip back to this chart that we love so much. This is the chart that we had of the kings and the prophets, right? This is what we use throughout our readings of the book of Kings. We looked at these prophets and kings, and when they overlapped in the north and the south. This is the south, the kingdom of Judah on this side, and this is the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel on the right. Again, King David rules a united kingdom, and then during Solomon's reign, it starts to fall apart. And when Solomon dies and his son Rehoboam takes over, Jeroboam becomes a separate king of the northern kingdom, and that is around 930, right? So David rules around 1000 DC, Solomon 970 to 930, and then right around 930, that's when Rehoboam, Solomon's son, David's grandson, takes over, and the kingdom separates. So the northern kingdom is actually the kingdom where Hosea will work. And we can see Hosea down here. He lives during this period here. He's not the first prophet that we read about in the north. We've read about a couple of other prophets, Ahijah, Jehu, Micah, Elijah. He's very famous. He's a northern prophet. Elisha, his student. We read about those prophets in the book of Kings. But these guys, Amos, Hosea, Jonah, Micah, These ones we're going to read about in these what we call minor prophets. Nahum, these are prophets of the north. Daniel is listed there, but Daniel is really not. Is not during that period, because here at this red bar right here, this is when the Assyrians destroy the northern kingdom and take the people away. And as you can see, Hosea is just before that time. It's a little confusing because there's a prophet Hosea and there's a king Hosea, and their names are really pronounced the same. It's only in English that we kind of make a differentiation. The name Hosea is a short version. It's a version of the name Yehoshua. The Yo or Yah part's not there, the name of God, and it's just Hosea, which means salvation. But it's a name that was very common. And so the fact that a king and a prophet were both named that is not surprising. But Hosea the prophet lives during just before that king, actually overlapped with him probably over his lifespan. But the part of this that we're reading about, which takes place around these 740 times, is a time when the Assyrians are starting to make their move in and starting to fight against us in the north, and they're having battles, they're winning victories, they're on the move. And as we're going to see from Hosea's point of view, they are about to destroy the north. And it's inevitable. So as we read Hosea, we actually are stepping back quite a bit from where we were with Ezekiel, who was talking about the Babylonian captivity. So we're going back about 150 years back. Now, there's not a lot of difference in necessarily the material culture of Israel and Judah in the land of Israel at that time. There's not a huge big difference between the material culture there. It's not real easy. If you're an archaeologist, you have to be really, really lucky to be able to get some clues to tell you when you found something, whether it's from the 750s or from the 600s. But what you do see, so by material culture, I mean, if you looked at what life was like 150 years ago in America, Civil War's just ended. People, if you were an archaeologist digging in America 500 years from now, and you came across a Civil War era, or not even a Civil War, let's just say you dug up a cemetery in Ohio or New York from the 1870s, 1880s, you'd see bodies that were buried that had, certain factors. And then if you dug up our bodies in the 2000s, you'd see other factors. For example, you'd see titanium implants and you'd see fillings, and you'd say, well, these people are different than those other people. They had a different material code. You'd see the clothes, you'd see the fabrics or the fibers of the clothes, and you'd say, those are different fibers. Sometimes think, what does our material culture say about us? You'd see people buried with probably cell phones and weird stuff that they're being buried with today. So yeah, so that you would be able to tell differences with our material culture. Not so much then. Pottery is kind of the same. There's not been any big, and again, you think about how much has happened in the last 200 years of the Industrial Revolution, how much stuff has changed. 3,000 years ago, things didn't change as fast, but you did have wars, you did have different incursions, and you would see different cultural influences. So yes, and you would see things from the Assyrians in this era, maybe even stuff from the Egyptian period still. And as you get closer to the 600s and 500s, you see more Babylonian culture.
Where are the Assyrians?
They're in modern day Iraq and modern day Syria. And so they're a little bit closer to Israel than Babylonia is, which is further south. But eventually, again, the Assyrians fall to the Babylonians, and the Babylonians crush them and take over all their territories, including ours. But of course, every time that happens, you have rebellions and you have people say, well, I might have paid tribute to the Assyrians, but I'm not going to pay tribute to the Babylonians, which of course is what happened in the land of Israel, where Judah, the kingdom of Judah, or the people of Judah said, oh, we're not going to do that anymore. And of course, the Babylonians crushed us. But it took 150 years. Between this period and this period was 150 years. Again, whether you think that's a long time or not, I guess it kind of depends on the way you view history. And I would say today, 150 years, a lot of changes happened in 150 years. I don't know if people felt that way back then. And I say that for this reason. If you're a person who views history as it's changing really fast, and I think we are people who see history changing really fast. It changes so fast sometimes that we don't even value history. Like we don't say, well, that happened, so it's going to happen again. I think people who saw stuff happening over 150 year periods sometimes said, yeah, this is the way history happens. It unfolds and these things happen and they come back. And nowadays we're like, well, that just happened, but something else is going to happen tomorrow, and something else is going to happen tomorrow. And I think people saw things more cyclical. I think people saw things, they saw the seasons pass and they saw years change, and they didn't go, well, that's last year. That don't mean anything now, which is, I think, the way we look at stuff today. But I think back then, and I don't even think it was back then, I think, before 200 years ago, when the pace of life was slower, I think people didn't expect things to change that much. And I think when people saw the Babylonians come, they were like, well, it's kind of like the Assyrians, but, is God going to be there with us this time? I mean, these questions kind of probably came up in slightly different ways than we look at them today. Again, it's hard for us to imagine what history felt like or what time felt like for our ancestors, but keep in mind, it probably felt different to them than it does to us. And I think about that now as we kind of step back 150 years ago, 150 years before Ezekiel back to Hosea. So you might think that that's a long time. Maybe for someone like Ezekiel, he didn't feel that Hosea lived that far back. I say that too because as Jews, we still, as a Jewish community, we talk about the rabbis who lived 1,000 years ago or 800 years ago. We talk about Maimonides, Rambam, like he lives today. People who study in yeshiva have this attitude that's been talked about, that they say, if somebody tells you that Rambam died 800 years ago, well, I just was talking to him today. I was studying him and I was reading him today. And so we don't see people necessarily living 800 years ago being that far away.
Like the United States 150 years ago was like totally different
Yeah.
than today.
Yeah. And I think there are communities, especially again, within the Jewish community, other more traditional communities, that try to live as if it's not really happening, and to success and maybe not success at doing that. But they literally are freezing time and saying, well, or not even freezing time, but just refuse to say that it really matters whether we live in the age that we live in. And sometimes I don't know that they're wrong. I sometimes think, technological advances don't necessarily, are not necessarily a gauge of human achievement or human progression, I should say. But yeah, we've stepped back to a time before the Babylonians are on the horizon. And to some extent, remember too, every kingdom that the Jewish people encounter is more powerful than the one that came before it. So the Assyrians were really powerful. They were the first empire. But then the Babylonians come and they're like a whole nother thing. And then the Greeks come and they're a whole nother thing. And then the
Well, what
Romans.
about the Egyptians?
It's interesting because you're right. The Egyptians to some extent were super powerful, right? But for us, we don't become independent as a people until after we leave Egypt.
Mhm.
Whether Egypt Egypt definitely invaded Israel, but Egypt was not our conqueror the way the Assyrians, we definitely include the Egyptians in the list of people who've persecuted us, but they persecuted us on their home ground, in all fairness. And again, the Egyptian pharaoh Shishak actually maybe was the one who we know from Raiders of the Lost Ark might have come in and captured the ark. So they did invade, but they never conquered and they never made Israel or Judah as a country part of their empire. The Assyrians did, Babylonians did, the Greeks did, and then the Romans did. And again, every time it got worse and worse and worse. Every time the Jews said, well, this can't be as bad as the previous one, and it was worse. So, yeah. What were you saying,
I
Phyllis?
was saying that maybe because the Mediterranean was, you know, in between, there wasn't a major seaport separating Israel from Syria.
Yeah, yeah, it was always a land bridge. And because it was a land bridge, it was always going to be at the center of fighting. Absolutely.
Always
So,
contested,
what?
always contested.
Always contested. Somebody always wanted to control it. And again, Israel has very little land mass. It has very little fertile, major fertile area for farming and for crop development. But it is at the crossroads of civilization. You know, whether that's going to still be an issue in the future, you know, as we've moved to more air travel and moving to moving to the internet and to having really almost a limitless landscape, you know, these kinds of land bridges are less critical. But you know, as we just saw, the waterways being cut off not too far away from this area is maybe part of this next world war we're a part of with Yemen and the Horn of Africa. So I don't know. I mean, there's definitely trade routes and land areas that are still valuable from the standpoint of intersections of the world, and the Middle East is definitely still one of them. Now, obviously, it has to do with oil and the product that actually comes out of the area too. But yeah, it's still at a critical place as the world, you know, is still shifting around where its power centers are. But yeah, so Hosea is living in this this time in the northern. He's living in the northern kingdom, so he's very concerned with what's going on with his kingdom and the Syrians that are even closer, because the Syrians have got to march through the north in order to get to the south. So that's geographically just an issue. And he is Hosea, as we're going to see, even though he's a northern prophet, he's very concerned with, and he's very clear that he's very concerned with the way that people are moving away from and not worshiping God. And I don't mean Elohim. I don't just mean God general, the God who took us out of Egypt, but specifically the God identified as Adonai, as Yud He Vav He, the name that we don't pronounce. That is the name that Hosea uses for God. He seems very concerned with people worshiping in Jerusalem. As a northern prophet, this is interesting because not all northern prophets seem to be that concerned with people worshiping in Jerusalem. Elijah not only isn't concerned with people necessarily worshiping in Jerusalem, he makes an altar and he challenges the prophets of Baal on a duel, right? On Mount Carmel. He made an altar. That may have been for show, but he doesn't ever else seem to be talking about necessarily worshiping in Jerusalem. Hosea is very concerned with that. The northern kingdoms definitely are worshiping other things besides God, which the southern kingdom is too. But the northern kingdom seems much more attached to Baal in particular, to that God, to Baal. It's not that Baal isn't worshipped in the south, but it seems like lots of gods are making their way into Jerusalem. But in the north, it's Baal, and we read about that. That's who Elijah is battling with there. Baal is the god that is the main Canaanite god. He's also the main god in Lebanon in the northern, just north, right? The Baal Tzafon, the Baal of the mountain there. The Baals that we found all around Lebanon. There's an area of Lebanon called Baalbek, which still has the name Baal in it. Baal was very big in for the Canaanites and for the Phoenicians. For the Canaanite people, the only thing that really differentiates Phoenicians is that they're Canaanites who live in the north, who don't live in Israel proper, but they worship the same gods. They speak the same language. The Phoenicians themselves didn't go, well, the Canaanites that live in Israel are not our people. They saw themselves as Canaanites. So they worship Baal, and they definitely have an effect on the north. A lot of Israelites seem to be worshiping both God and Baal. It shouldn't surprise us is that we have syncretic merges of religion even today. There are a lot of interfaith families that celebrate Christmas. Nobody says, hey, they're celebrating. And there's Jews that are all Jewish that celebrate Christmas, that still have Christmas trees. And there's not one Gentile in the house, and they're still celebrating Christmas. So, we have stuff today that we would say, hey, people have blended different traditions and different faiths.
But
Did
Baal is
people?
not around anymore.
Baal's not around anymore, but a lot of that stuff that we do on Christmas is directly from the pagan tradition and not from any biblical source. Nobody goes, well, you're worshiping a pagan evergreen tree in your house. But some people say that, not usually Jews are saying that, but
My mother, my future mother-in-law.
The Puritans were Christian and very upset with, all
Yes.
this pagan Christian.
they did not like it.
Christmas.
You're absolutely
Yeah.
right, Rosemary. The Puritan and some of those people in North New England were hesitant to accept it. But if we looked at the material culture of Jews today, and somebody did an archaeological dig through someone's Jewish house, they'd see the mezuzah on the door, and they'd see the Christmas tree or the Christmas decorations in the closet, and they'd say, was this house Jewish or Christian? Well, they know. What do they know? It's like the people who excavate in Norway today and find the Thor hammer on one side and the cross on the other on the same necklace. People are like, I'll cover my bases. I'll have a little bit of both. So look, for Hosea and for the prophets, they can't wrap their head around that. And of course, these were theological and moral, decisions as well. These were ways that, in some ways, that people were behaving and ordering their lives around Baal, which again could have led to human sacrifice, which some Baal worship did, and definitely different things like cultic prostitution. And there's a very interesting discussion, as we're going to read now, whether one of the things that's at work here in the discussion about Hosea is there cultic prostitution in the background. Is that something that's going on in this? But the Babylonians, the Canaanites did have cultic prostitution. Babylonians did too, but the Canaanites are what we're dealing with here, and we're going to open up now Hosea. I will say one thing about it too. Hosea, according to most biblical scholars, is one of the most difficult books to translate, and it's fairly corrupted. They say corrupted in the sense that it doesn't seem to really make sense. Now, part of this, some of it, we have a hard time understanding why it's written the way it is. Part of it, we think now, as we've discovered some of the Canaanite texts, is that in the north, they spoke a slightly different Hebrew than they did in the south. They had a different dialect. We don't have a lot of it because almost all of our Bible is created in the southern kingdom of Judah. But that the north spoke a slightly different version of it. One of the reasons why we think that that's probably the case is that we don't have a lot of text of Hosea in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but the Dead Sea Scrolls are the same way. The Septuagint, the Greek text, doesn't help us at all because there's translations there in the Greek text that don't even make sense. But we think that part of the problem is just a dialectical difference in the north, that we don't quite get some of their word order and some of their structure, which is different than it is in Judah. It's not like it's totally different, but it's different enough that what we see as kind of corrupted or doesn't quite make sense is probably just the way Hosea wrote or the way Hosea spoke, and somebody wrote it down. We do believe that it was edited or redacted by a Judean editor, but there's no reason to believe that Hosea isn't the Hosea that we think he is, who he describes and where he lives, which again is right before the destruction of the northern kingdom, which he sees coming and which he basically tells people, you've got it coming to you. There is something special probably for the southern people who kept this book, because remember, northern kingdom got destroyed, got exiled. A lot of the people got exiled, but they found so much in common with Hosea, and they found like Hosea was kind of like, seeing this happen to his kingdom, that they probably said, this is a great lesson for us. Let's keep this book. Let's use this as a guide. And that's why we have them. Yeah.
When did Aramaic become
The language?
the conversational language supposed to Hebrew?
Yeah, really after the Babylonian destruction. When the Jews came back from Babylonia, the Babylonians, were the authority, right? There's no more Jewish kings. And the Babylonians, for matters of correspondence and matters of business, did everything in Aramaic. And so the Jews, there was no reason for them not to learn Aramaic. It was the language of not just Israel, but the language of Syria, the language of Lebanon, the language of Jordan. I mean, that whole Middle East area, they were speaking Aramaic. Did the Babylonians speak Aramaic? Yeah, they spoke it more than they spoke Hebrew and these other. So for them, making Aramaic the main language of the area was easier for them, because while they spoke their own Akkadian, based language, which was similar, but not exactly the same as Aramaic, for their kingdom, they said, just speak Aramaic in all that whole area. They basically said everything west, that area, you'll all speak Aramaic. So for Babylonia, it was really an administrative decision. It's the same reason why the Romans, they let everybody in Israel speak Greek. They didn't speak Latin in ancient Israel during the Roman period. They spoke Greek. Why? Because that whole region of the eastern of the Mediterranean, Lebanon, Turkey, all those places, they all spoke Greek, and they just said, keep speaking Greek. We don't care. The Romans, they spoke Latin in Rome, but in their empire, they spoke Greek. They wrote Greek. All the letters are in Greek. All the cemetery stuff is in Greek. So just because, it's an interesting issue, because like we think today, if we're going to make a country like us, they're going to all speak English. They're all, they have to speak our language. But there's this other way that people did things, which was they said, you don't have to speak our language, but this whole region, stop speaking 25 different dialects. Just speak one dialect. And we did it. We're the new people who do it, but the British did it, the French did it. Every time they conquered, part of Africa or part of Asia, they said, I don't care what you speak, just speak one of these languages. You're not going to speak Zulu and, this Bantu language and this language, just speak one language. And for the tribes people who lived there, like, that's not my language, but they said, this is your language for this region. And the Babylonians did that with Aramaic. And it's close enough to Hebrew that most Jews just said, fine, it's not a big deal. But they didn't, but yeah, around 500, 400 BCE, all the way to the time of Jesus, they were speaking Aramaic there. The interesting thing is how quickly Jews stopped speaking Aramaic. But look, how many years did it take us to stop speaking Yiddish? We spoke Yiddish for 1,000 years, and we gave it up in 2 generations. 2 generations, we know, most of us know 20 words of Yiddish. Every one of our grandparents or great-grandparents, that's the only language that some of them knew. And we don't know any of it. So how quickly can people lose a language? Real quick. And if you don't understand that, think about how many Yiddish words you know, and think about how many Yiddish words your grandparents knew. Because that's the only words that they knew. It's the only words they knew. Maybe they knew a little Russian, maybe they knew a little Hebrew, maybe they knew a little German. They threw in a little stuff like that because they spoke the language where they lived, a little Hungarian. They all spoke Yiddish. So, yeah. Did the Jews pick up Aramaic? Yeah. Did they forget it, or did they leave it behind when they moved to the different places where we moved to, whether it was a Arab country or whether it was a Spanish country or whether it was a French country? Yeah, probably. Because we do it. And sometimes that language has a bigger effect on us than others. So here is the beginning of Hosea. And as I tell you, it just pops right in. So we don't know anything really about Hosea other than who his dad is. We really aren't even sure where he lived. We're not exactly sure where he lived, except he lived in the north. and we know when he lived. But this insertion here, which is done by an editor, is all we know about it. And you'll see how much we just pop into this stuff. So there's not a lot, there's not a lot of setup for it. And again, that's not uncommon with the prophets, but this one, bam, we're right into it. All right, Rosemary, if you'd be so kind as to start us of Hosea.
The word of God that came to Hosea, son of Beeri, in the reigns of kings Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah of Judah, and in the reign of King Jeroboam, son of Joash of Israel.
So first it gives us the kings that were in charge of Judah, and then it gives us the kings of the north. Jeroboam, there's two Jeroboams. This is Jeroboam the second. By the way, this kind of gives away that this insertion was written by a Judean author. He wouldn't have cared necessarily. He definitely wouldn't have put first who were the kings of Judah during his time. He lived under Jeroboam and Joash in Israel. Those were his kings. So the editor wants us to know when he lived. And again, Be'eri is the name, of course, of the kibbutz that was violently attacked on October 7th. The name Be'eri it's a person's name. In this case, it was Hosea's name. It's one of the names we know of in the Bible. So he is Hosea ben Be'eri. That's his name. The word Be'er by itself means a well, a cistern. That's what the word Be'er, that's the root of it. And so it tells us when he lived, which is during the time right before the destruction of the northern kingdom, which was again based in Samaria. Samaria was the capital of the north. Jerusalem was the capital of the south. And here we go.
When God first spoke to Hosea, God said to Hosea, "Go, get yourself a wife of whoredom and children of whoredom, for the land will stray from following God."
Yeah, it just goes right into it. That's why, as I said, it's boom. It's right there. There's no setup. There's nothing. So let's just look at this line right here for a second before we move on. Other than the fact that I will tell you, the next line says he goes and does it. This is mind-blowing because, as I said, there was cultic prostitution going on at the time. Okay, maybe she was a cultic prostitute, except that's not the word. The word that's used here is the root. It's znonim. Znonim is the word, and zonah is a prostitute. It's the word for a escort, prostitute, hooker, whatever you want to say. It's not the word that's used for a cultic prostitute. There's a different word used for that. It's a kadesha. It's for the word kadosh, a sanctified prostitute. It's possible that that's what she was, and they just use it that way. This is a general term. It's all bad. It's all not what you're supposed to do. But that's not what it says. And it also says your children were supposed to be of this union, of this situation, of this way. Normally, cultic prostitutes don't have children. They're not supposed to. They're having children is not what the role of a cultic prostitute is. Chastity was actually usually a requirement for that. We're not 100% sure of how cultic prostitution worked. I want to make it clear. We have the sources that we have about cultic prostitution are almost entirely written by people who hated cultic prostitution, including Jews, including Christians, and other people who looked at this as a horrible situation. But
Well, they had it in historical times in India, so we must know how it works somewhere.
we do, but we're careful not to extrapolate from what people do or do in other regions. But in the Middle East and in the descriptions that we have where Jews and Christians who encountered this in this area, it's never good. And it's also never one where we see that people have children with it. So that's a possibility, but it doesn't seem that that's what's happening here. It doesn't seem like this is a cultic prostitution situation where, like, go marry a person who's involved in what you're trying to stop. Okay, that doesn't seem to be the case. The fact that God would tell a prophet to do something that affects their lives. We saw it already. We just saw it in Ezekiel, the last prophet we read. I mean, Ezekiel had to lay down on the ground and roll around on the ground, had to make poop cakes, or cakes baked on poop or whatever. I mean, those are things that Ezekiel had to do. Ezekiel was told his wife was going to die and he couldn't mourn her, which at least also affected his family. I mean, it doesn't say God killed her, but she dies, and that's the signal that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. So the fact that prophets have to do stuff, I mean, Jonah has to go to Nineveh. I mean, that seems almost simple compared to this. But there are a lot of people who don't like the idea that this actually happened. There are also people who don't like the idea that Jonah actually happened, which is why there are some of our commentators who said Jonah's story is a dream. It didn't really happen. Why can they do that? Because a lot of the prophets have visions, right? Ezekiel had visions. Didn't necessarily happen. It didn't like physically happen. Did it actually happen? And so Maimonides, Radak, Rabbi Kimchi, a lot of the commentators of the medieval period said this didn't happen. God would not tell somebody to go do this.
So why would they include it? Why would they canonize it and put it in the Bible?
It's not that it's not important lesson. It's just that this is a vision. This is not something, this is an allegory. This is a metaphor. This is something that God told him to do, but in the sense of like, play this out. Don't do it, but run this scenario and imagine this thing happens. I don't believe that. I don't believe that's the case, but people had such a hard time. Our sages had such a hard time imagining that God would do this to somebody that they don't like it. They really, really don't like it. They don't like the fact that God would do this to somebody. Look, I mean, God made Noah build an ark. It took hundreds of years for him to build an ark. God makes people do hard things. This one seems to be really, really hard.
But this is easy, get yourself a wife that's a whore.
Well, it's easy to find one. It's not easy to live like that.
And have children?
Yes. But that's why people say, why would God do that? Why would God make somebody do this?
Well,
And they
they
don't like it.
still weren't sure, that if a woman had intercourse with somebody else, that the children she had wouldn't be affected by that.
Well, not only that, the assumption here is they're not your kids. The assumption is these are not your children. You have to raise someone else's children. You've been cuckolded. That's the whole point of this. These are not your children. These are children that you're raising that are not that don't have your DNA. And again, according to what we know about the way human beings react, that there's an animalistic urge that we have, which is we want to promote our own DNA. I just want to tell you, it's just a fact. And so if this was really what is happening, which is 100%, what?
Is God telling him to marry a woman who already has children and adopt them, or is he saying
Well,
the children she has are going to be sired by her,
or
that she's is he saying she's going to continue to be promiscuous?
Well, we'll watch what happens. I mean, it's a little difficult from here, it seems like she already has kids, right? But we're going to get to that.
Okay.
I'm more interested in the for the land will stray. Like why is Hosea getting a wife of whoredom and a children of whoredom?
It's performance art.
Yes, and this is what Ezekiel does, right? Ezekiel makes a model of Jerusalem and then has everyone see it get destroyed. This is performance art with his life. The word that is used is the land will stray, the land will whore. It says, Tiznei haaretz. The land, the people of Israel are whoring away. I mean, that's why some people said that this really didn't happen, because it's so obvious. I mean, it's not an allegory. He tells them right away what it is, which is what happens in Ezekiel too. I mean, all of the performance already does. We're told right away what it is. You don't have to figure it out. So let's look what happens here with this guy. But yeah, our sages did not feel comfortable that this could have really happened, that God really would have done this. For some people, this is a step too far. I don't know. I don't feel that way, but it's possible, given that the prophets have visions, but not everything that they see, they're actually experiencing it in real time. Okay. So here's what it says.
So he went and married Gomer, daughter of Divlaim. She conceived and bore him a son. And God instructed him, name him Jezreel, for I will soon punish the house of Jehu for the bloody deeds at Jezreel and put an end to the monarchy of the house of Israel.
That is the monarchy of the previous king, of the previous dynasty. And again, if we look at let me show you real quick. So here's what we're talking about. We're talking about these kings from the house of Jehu. This is Jehu who becomes king. Elisha is the one who tells Jehu he's going to be king, if you recall. Jehu, then you have Jehoash, Joash, and then Jeroboam the second. And then when Jeroboam is the second is killed, then you have the next dynasty. The next dynasty takes over. During this period of time, when he's writing, when Hosea is writing too, if you want to take a quick look, from about 750, when Jeroboam dies, so Jeroboam's alive in 753. 753 to 740, look how many people are king. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's not good. 6 kings in less than, 40 years, right? 50 years, less than 40, around 40 years. That's not good. That's a lot of instability. And that's when he's, that's when he's working. So, so the first son's born. His name is Jezreel, which is a place, right? Jezreel, there's the valley of Jezreel. And this name it's not a good reason to name him that. It's the bloody deeds done at Jezreel. And it says right here, talking about Baal and gods that are being worshipped there. But it's going to be bad, right? His name is going to tell us that we're going to have an end, not just to the house of Jehu, but to the whole monarchy of the house of Israel. But the first kid's name is Jezreel, which is just the place. So yeah, it's not a great name because of what it means, but on the face of it, it's just the name of the place. That's not going to be the case with the rest. So again, we know this person's name. We know her father's name. So she has a first name and last name. It seems like this is a real person. If this was just a prophecy, if this was, or not a prophecy, but just a vision, if it's just like things that don't necessarily have to happen in the real world, but like could happen, a scenario, if you will. If this was, why would it give us her first and last name? So it does not seem like this is not really happening in real time. It seems like this is playing out in his life. So they have the first kid. She has the first kid. And this is a kid named Jezreel. And it says,
In that day, I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. She conceived.
And that's it. That's it. That's going to be where that's where you get defeated. And of course, that's the area not far from where Armageddon is. Armageddon is in the valley of Jezreel. So it's a place where there were a lot of battles. And the last battle, the battle of the apocalypse, is supposed to take place there too. So Jezreel, it's kind of a pretty name, but it's not a good reason. It's where the battle will take place too. All right. So,
She conceived again and bore a daughter, and he was told, name her Lo Ruhamah, for I will no longer accept the house of Israel or pardon them. But I will accept the house of Judah, and I will give them victory through the eternal their God. I will not give them victory with bow and sword and battle by horses and riders.
okay, so this is the second child as a daughter, and her name is Lo Ruhumah. That's a horrible name, right? Look at what the name means in literal, unpitied. From the word rachem, right, which means mercy. Literally means womb, by the way, too. Not pitied. If you think about it, it also means no womb. I wonder if anyone's ever done a commentary on that. Somebody who doesn't have a uterus would be called Lo Ruhumah. Seriously. But here it's meant to be understood as unpitied. There's not going to be any mercy for you. It's done. It's done. So this girl has to be named No Pity. That's her name. According to this is playing out. This is now her name for the rest of her life. No Pity. Not a great way to start life. And this is why, again, people are like, would God really do this to people? Would God really make them play this out? That's not it. What? He was definitely mad. And again, in the scheme of things, you're right. To take it to an extent, this is nothing compared to what's going to happen or what could happen. Take a lesson from this, which again, is a little clue here. I will accept the house of Judah. You could understand why the Judahites like this book. Even though it was
But I
written in the north, it makes them look okay.
But I will accept the house of Judah, and I will give victory to them through the eternal their God. I will not give them victory with bow and sword and battle by horses and riders. After weaning Lo Ruhumah, she conceived and bore a son. Then God said, name him Lo Ami, for you are not my people, and I will not be your God.
Yeah, and that's terrible name to have as a kid. Lo on me, I'm not your people. That's terrible. So 3 kids. The last 2 get really tough names. And if you're Jezreel, you're like, I like my name. These names are tough. And so the fact that God would hit somebody with these kind of things is really, really tough. Very hard. Because it's also not just on the prophets, it's on the kids too. The kids have to suffer to some extent as examples for the rest of the people. So this performance art doesn't affect him, it's affecting his whole family. So this is why, again, to go back to what Rosemary said before, are the kids his or do they have to have kids? The kids seem to be born and he's naming the kids, right? So he's part of the naming process. So it doesn't seem like she had the kids ahead of time. It seems like the kids are part of the package, if you will. So not only has he been cuckolded, he's got to name them these names. And these kids are reflections of how the Israelites have been behaving. So we're told right away. It's not like you have to figure it out. The Israelites are they're whoring after other gods and not worshiping God. And so this guy's life is a reflection of that and is a reminder of what the people are doing. God takes a person and makes him, again, to some extent, the example of what's happening around him and to focus attention on what people shouldn't do.
You know, he didn't take into account, I don't think, the brevity of their lives.
Who? God didn't? Because?
The average life expectancy was what then, right?
Yeah, so, but let's say it's 70 years. That's what they said. That's what the Bible says. Okay, but the Bible says you get 70 years. So maybe you didn't, maybe you died early, but if you get 70 years, your life should have been enough to, well, let's put it this way, even if, correct, but it's not, here's the thing. If you, look, I that's why, like, I don't want to make it seem like, well, they were just worshiping another God, big deal, you know? you know, using the Christmas tree analogy is silly because we have similar values to our Christian brothers and sisters. And so a lot of, I don't say all of our values are the same, but we have a lot of the same values. So it's not that big of a deal. Right? Clearly, the people worshiping Baal and Canaanites and everywhere have a different set of values. And it's not translating into really good behavior. How do we know that? Because there's 6 kings in 30 years. So these guys are killing themselves. Oh, by the way, of those 6 kings, only one of them died a natural death. So we talked about it. We read about it in Kings, you know, it was now almost a year ago, but we were reading about these kings that just kept getting killed by the next king. The next guy came up. This is not, nobody wants to live in a society like that. It's terrible. So it's not just we're worshiping the wrong God. They were on the wrong path. They were on a path towards destruction. And so,
It's more. This is the time. People are learning how to live, right? They're learning how to live with each other for a short period of time. So the survival of the leaders, right? That makes sense, right? It's kill or be killed.
so when,
Drink, marry, and whore,
yes.
and then we die.
So yes,
God
people,
was pissed.
people here are learning that they have an accountability that's higher than, and they're learning this for the first time in human history. That is fair to say, but that's the job of the Jewish people to some extent at this time, which is to tell people the rules of the way you worship gods before are different because what you're supposed to be doing every day of your life is different. If you're worshiping gods that behave really no better than you, then of course that's what you're going to do, right? So if you're worshiping Bacchus and you're having a Roman orgy because that's what Bacchus does, you're behaving like God. If you're taking care of people who are sick and if you feel compelled to help people less fortunate than you because that's what God does, you got a different set of values. And it is, yes, this is the beginning of an ethical framework of, you know, ethical monotheism. That is the first time we see this in human history. We can claim responsibility, thankfully, for giving this to people. But yeah, it is a whole different way of it is a whole way of living life differently because we're living with a different God. We're living with a different set of expectations. Because
Isn't that too much pressure?
is it too much pressure to put on humanity?
You know, I'm reading the notes here.
Yeah.
I'm reading what you're saying. It's all dovetailing together.
Yeah.
Right? And people were looking around going, wow, you know, we're here for such a short period of time.
Yep.
People are dying. You know, we're being told by
Yes.
these people that this is, you know, what God wants. That's scary enough.
Yes.
The pleasures of.
So your point is, doesn't it make sense that people would not want to live a life that requires them to be good to people during the small amount of time that they're here? Is that what you're saying?
It's good to people. It's, in other words, God wants them to be monogamous with him. I get that. And then the gods that represent, you know, like you were saying, Bacchus and all the, which I'm not privy, you know, listen, I didn't say. So, but let's just say there's a god to beer and wine and sex. And,
Yeah.
And everything, right?
Yeah.
And the reason they're there is because all of a sudden these people over a few generations or many generations, they're getting pleasure for these things. And so they identify or they create something that represents that. I get that.
Yeah, this is hard.
Yeah.
This is hard, but this is the only way for civilization to not eat each other up.
It's very subtle, and maybe I can't express it well enough to get the point across. But it seems to me that we're confusing ourselves because we're calling two different entities that are very, very different than one another, identifying them with the same term, namely God. The God that the Jewish people introduced to the world is as different from the concept of the God that people had before them as a horse and carriages from an airplane. It's a whole different thing.
But it fulfilled a similar need, a similar role in the lives of people.
It's the opposite. The God that we created is a transcendental, unitary God for all of humanity, with transcendent values, universal morality, whether you come from Babylonia, whether you're my people or their people, or my family or their people. That's not how the world was before this transcendent God was transcendent God was introduced into the world. And more than that, it took the Jewish people 1,000 years to refine that idea. Because if you read Torah, there's lots of gods in Torah.
Yeah.
Wait. I don't get that at all.
What? There's a lot
Leaders are doing
that there's lots of gods.
No.
Jealous God, what are you jealous of?
No, the Jewish people created God. God, if you go back to.
I understand, but okay, but what
God is God.
I understand, but
No,
what
it's not.
No, it's not.
but what
So
wait, so okay, but what Ronnie's saying, so what Ronnie's saying is, at least the conception, or at least the way human beings refer to God changes with us, and it changes dramatically, but it also takes time. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes a while, and so the Bible reflects that. Now, what's hard, and again, and these are arguments that biblical scholars have, how early are the earliest versions of a unitary single God that is one God? I have biblical scholars that I trust who read the Torah even more than I do, who say that there is a version of that God in the earliest sources. It's not always in the earliest sources. It's not every early source, but there are early sources of the Bible that seem to imply that there's only God. Whether every Israelite got that, it's pretty clear that they didn't.
Right. That's the way.
Well, how do we know that? Because Hosea just told us that they're not. They're so bad that I don't even know what to do. I guess we just got to destroy the northern kingdom. But it's a struggle. But the people there is the God that Hosea is telling people to worship in 7:20 is a God that is only God, right? We know that. There's only that God for us. And then there's this idea that we start to see in Hosea lives, remember, around the same time as the first Isaiah, that early Isaiah. We're starting to see a God who's everywhere, that the whole world is God's. I might be in Jerusalem, but I'm everywhere. That's where we start to see it very clearly that's there. But again, for people, and John's right, for the very beginning, when you say God is at the beginning of creation, God is clearly there at creation. There is no question that God is doing the creating. Is that a important thing? Is that a not important thing? Look, we don't know. And there's arguments again between the biblical scholars of how monotheistic the J author was who wrote part of that, or whatever. The point is that there is a God, at least in Genesis, that is a God who is by itself and is creating, at least in some versions of it, that is creating by himself or by itself. Definitely seems to be him, but let's say God is a single entity. But again, clearly the people are hesitant to believe that. I'm not saying that out of school. I'm saying it because Hosea just said it. So let's talk about this poor dude who is now dealing with a wife who he knew from the beginning. It's not like she cheated on him. He without him knowing, he knew what he was getting into. God told him. So here's what it says about what he does now.
The number of the people of Israel shall be like that of the sands of the sea, which cannot be measured or counted. And instead of being told, you are not my people, they shall be called children of the living God.
Well, that's a great idea, right? And that also tells us B'nai El Chai, which again is the name that says God, but a living God, the children of a living God. That's already now, things will get better. But here's what it says.
The people of Judah and the people of Israel shall assemble together and appoint one head over them, and they shall rise from the ground. For marvelous shall be the day of Jezreel.
So Jezreel will turn out to be okay. One second.
Oh, call your brothers my people, and your sisters lovingly accepted. Remonstrate your mother, remonstrate her, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband, and let her put away her whoredom from her face, and her adultery from between her breasts. Else will I strip her naked and leave her as on the day she was born, and I will make her like a wilderness, render her like desert land, and let her die of thirst. I will also disown her children, for they are now a whore's brood, in that their mother has played the whore. She that conceived them has acted shamelessly, because she thought, I will go after my lovers who supply my bread and my water, my wool and my linen, my oil and my drink. Assuredly, I will hedge up her roads with thorns and raise walls against her, and she shall not find her paths. Pursue her lovers as she will, she shall not overtake them, and seek them as she may, she shall never find them. Then she will say, I will go and return to my first husband, for then I fared better than now.
So this metaphor, this relationship that he has is going to, and again, the language of it is a little strange. And so again, it's very similar to what we'd have in Judah, but probably a little bit different, but it's enough that we can kind of understand what's happening, what's playing out here, which is God is making sure that Israel is punished for what it did by going after these other gods. God will take them back, but they have to be to some extent punished because they have to give up these ways. They have to give up what they're doing. There's an issue here which people have talked about, which gets brought up. When what we don't read about Hosea, we don't really know exactly how this is all playing out, which is again why some people say the whole thing's imagined, because it doesn't quite flow in a linear fashion. But did every time she came home with a kid or pregnant, whatever, she came home and there was a kid there, but she's pregnant, every time is Hosea saying to himself, is this my kid or is this someone else's kid? And what was happening, like, I don't know. Whenever the first time I read this as a child, I probably didn't really grasp what's happening here because like I hadn't been in love with anybody before. And so the idea that someone would keep taking back someone that cheated on them was like, well, that doesn't make any sense. She had a baby with somebody else. The marriage is over. And what I didn't understand was that's not the way things happen. That's not the way things always happen. So there's something really powerful about this story, which is one of the reasons why Hosea is sometimes called the prophet of love. A lot of people think that the story sounds a little Christian. Well, it's 700 years earlier than Christianity. And the reason why I say that, and the reason why people have said that, why I'm repeating that, is because there's a level to this where Christians have oftentimes identified with this story because the story seems to be one of forgiveness of repeated sin. And for people who have been in a relationship with somebody who has cheated on them a lot, or for someone who's had addiction and problems of committing to somebody without letting other things interfere with that commitment, with that love, people are like, well, just get divorced. And the story is one of like, oh, we're gonna keep working at it. We're doing it. And it's interesting that people don't see that as a Jewish idea because it's clearly in Hosea. But it definitely seems like for centuries, we've been kind of given this idea that like that's what Christians do. Like, Christians will go into a prison and tell somebody, just turn your life over to Christ. It's like Jews don't do that. Well, I spent 8 years visiting inmates in prison. I never told anyone, turn your life over to God and you'll be okay, you'll be forgiven. But I definitely gave them books and I gave them help and I spoke to them and I hoped that they would find a better path. But it wasn't one of saying, well, you turn your life over to Christ and things will be fine. That's not what happens here. And that's not really the story, but on the face of it, it seems like it's one of those kind of stories, which is why I actually looked this up a couple of days ago. Somebody did a recent movie a few years ago. A Christian filmmaker did a version of a Hosea that was set in the modern day, which I love. I love those kind of ideas of those things happening. But it's a story of a man who's in love with a woman who keeps cheating on him. And, it's basically one of those kind of stories, which I'm sure I haven't seen it, but I'd like to see it now that I know about it, but, with a religious overtone. It doesn't really work though, because this is not about forgiving somebody who's cheated on them and let's just believe in God and things will be okay. The story here is one of the relationship that the sex that she's having with other people is not really important. It's reflective of what the Israelites are doing. It doesn't really matter that she's having kids with other people. First of all, we know she's going to do it. God told him it's going to happen. So there's not like, oh, I'm so disappointed in you, honey. You came home and these are not our kids. These are not my kids. I'm not responsible for these kids. That's not what happened. God told him from the beginning what was going to happen. And he told him from the beginning that this is a metaphor. So it doesn't really work just to say, well, this is a story of a man who loves a fallen woman. That's not what's happening here. And it's not like you loving somebody and I'll just keep taking them back. That's not what's happening here. This is a metaphor for a whole relationship with God versus what the other people are doing, which is not just a different church that are going to. It's not like they're worshiping a different, version of how we understand God. If they're going over to Baal, they're doing a whole bunch of stuff. They're engaged in a whole different framework and to some extent have a whole different philosophy and understanding of life that at least Hosea, and if God is telling them, then God is telling people, that's not a life for you. That's not a life that you can live. And so that's why just saying that we can do a modern version of this or imagine that you were in love with a woman who keeps cheating on you, probably, again, you're not really getting what's happening here. I didn't get it when I was a kid, but I also thought about it in terms of just love and just a relationship. But there is something very powerful here for people who've had a relationship with somebody who's disappointed them over and over and over again, which is that God has been disappointed by us over and over and over again, yet God is not giving up on us. And so the strange thing is that we're supposed to sympathize through Hosea with God. That's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to step back and go, oh, this isn't about like love that I had, but look at God and look at how many times we've disappointed God and God keeps taking us back. So, it's, you got to take it a little bit out of your mind, you know. So let's take a look at the end of this chapter.
And she did not consider this. It was I who bestowed on her the new grain and wine and oil. I who lavished silver on her and gold, which they used for Baal. Assuredly, I will take back my new grain in its time and my new wine in its season, and I will snatch away my wool and my linen that serve to cover her nakedness.
Yeah, and this is what we're supposed to sympathize with. God gave us all these wonderful bounties, wonderful country that we can harvest and do all this stuff with. We turned it into money, and then we gave that money to Baal. Now, again, this would be like a woman who's turning her money over that you've given her to another lover or to some other guy, whatever. That's what God sees what we're doing with our stuff that we're giving to Baal. And he doesn't even say to the other guy there, he says to Baal. But of course, the word Baal in Hebrew has two different meanings. It means both husband or man, and it means the God. So it actually is a play on it. But yeah, I mean, it's a terrible thing because not only is she cheating on him, she's also giving his stuff to this other guy. Again, says flat out, it's Baal. So
now will I uncover her shame in the very sight of her lovers, and not one of them shall save her from me. And I will end all her rejoicing, her festivals, new moons and Sabbaths, all her festive seasons. I will lay waste her vines and her fig trees, which she thinks are a fee she received from her lovers. I will turn them into brushwood, and beasts of the field shall devour them. Thus will I punish her for the days of the Baalim on which she brought them offerings. When decked with earrings and jewels, she would go after her lovers, forgetting me, declares God.
yeah, so you know, there's not just one Baal, there's lots of Baals, right? There's different Baals. Every mountain has a different Baal on it. And there's a lot of Baals. And yeah, and that's what this woman is doing. And so everything's going to be over. God's saying, you have those festivals and all those things that you enjoy doing, those are going to come to an end. Those are coming to an end because you took that time and you were offering up stuff to Baal. Yep. So you took that stuff, the stuff that I gave you, and you're giving it to Baal. So again, we're supposed to sympathize with God. That's what we're supposed to do right now. We're supposed to understand this from God, from God's point of view. Are there women who give stuff to guys and then they give them to other women? Yes, absolutely. But oftentimes, again, they're talking about a man who's supporting a woman who's giving his wife things, and then she's giving them to the guy that. So if this has never happened to you, thank God it shouldn't happen to you. It's a nightmare, really, for anybody in a relationship. Do you know who depicted this really well? Oh my gosh, I just thought of it. One of the great movies when he was making movies that made sense. Casino, Martin Scorsese in that movie, with Robert De Niro and Sharon Stone. She keeps going back to her old boyfriend who was also a pimp. Remember that? And it was played by the great actor James Woods. Played the boyfriend, Sharon Stone's boyfriend, who was actually based on a real dude. I mean, these were real people. And yeah, so he was taking care of his wife, and his wife would take the money that she was getting from De Niro's character, and she would give it to her old boyfriend, who's a pimp and drug dealer and stuff like that. So De Niro doesn't take kindly to that, beats the guy up. But yeah, it was depicted powerfully in that movie. But and that's obviously not the only movie that it's in, but that's one I could think of. But yeah, it was Hosea's way of reminding, again, mostly male audience, that this is what you're doing to God. It's very powerful.
Assuredly, I will speak coaxingly to her and lead her through the wilderness and speak to her tenderly. I will give her vineyards from there, and the valley of Ahor as a plowland of hope. There she shall respond as in the days of her youth, when she came up from the land of Egypt. And in that day, declares God, you will call me she, and no more will you call me Baali.
Now that's a wonderful play on words, right? Because again, the word Ishi means my husband, and no longer Baali, which also means my husband. So Ishi means my man or my husband, and Baali means my master or my husband, but also it means Baal. So you're not going to use the word Baal anymore. You're not going to call me your Baali. You're going to call me your Ishi. You're going to call me your man, not your Baal. Now,
But we still use Baali, we said in the Micha Mocha.
yes, we use the word Baal sometimes. We don't use it a lot. Definitely our ancestors used it more. But again, it's a word. It's like other words that took on other meanings because they only had about 8,000 words. And so there's limited vocabulary and there's limited amount of words that you have for things. And the word Baal means husband, Lord, master. And again, just like the word Adonai means Lord, master. And the word Ishi, though, definitely has more of the word man in it, has more of an intimate, and no longer has that meaning of the word Baal, that God. So it's interesting how it's a play on words, and it works, if you I explained it to you, so you can now see the words Ishi and Baali, but yes. And we use the word Baal sparingly, but we use it sometimes, right? We call the person who runs the house of Baal Habayit, right? The Baal Habayit is the person who runs the house, the master of the house. But in Yiddish, it's Balabusta, Balabais, Balabais. And the Balabais becomes Balabusta, which is oftentimes the woman, right? The woman's the Balabusta. But the Balabait literally means the master of the house. So who's the master of the house? Is the Balabusta is usually the mom. But that's the irony of Yiddish language in general, and the fact that the word Baal has taken on new meanings depending on the culture and depending on the time.
And Balavista was a complimentary term
Yep.
for a woman who kept a nice house.
Yes. A Balabusta. Now people just think it sounds like ball buster, and I think it probably had other meanings when people started thinking about it in English, going, that woman is definitely a ball buster. And what does that mean? She runs the house, and she's yeah. Anyways, the point is that language has a funny way of meandering through homophones and different meanings. It takes on different meanings. But yeah, that's the word Baal there too. But yeah, people don't use that word as much in Hebrew today, Baal, for husband either. We use the word Ish or Isha, Ishti, which is my wife, Ishi. And people use the word beloved now a lot more too, which is Dodi. Anyways, so yeah, let's get rid of that word Baali.
For I will remove the names of the Baalim from her mouth, and they shall never more be mentioned by name. In that day I will make a covenant for them with the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, and the creeping things of the ground. I will also banish bow, sword, and war from the land. Thus I will let them lie down in safety.
That's a nice thing, right?
Wish that
Take
would
away all
happen.
those, take away all those bad things, right? Yeah, things will be, they'll be at peace. Not going to remember those Baal names anymore. And it happened. We hardly know any of those Baal names anymore. We only know them because they're in the Bible. We didn't know about Baal Zephon. We didn't know about Baal Zevav, the Lord of the Flies, right? That's became one of the names of Satan. That's how bad Baal-zebub became. Yeah, there's another Baal there. But we didn't know those. I mean, we don't know them anymore. We knew them. Those were all these Baals that we had out there. But yeah, that's where the word Lord of the Flies comes from. Baal-zebub. Zavav is a fly because Zavav is an onomatopoeia. Zavav. So that's Baal-zebub, Lord of the Flies for those Exorcist fans. But yeah, that's not something that you should have in your mouth. So we turned them into demons.
Mhm.
All right, now here's a very famous line.
And I will espouse you forever. I will espouse you with righteousness and justice and with goodness and mercy, and I will espouse you with faithfulness. Then you shall be devoted to God.
Beautiful lines. Arashtich li leolam, arashtich li betzedek u'mishpat, v'chesed u'v'rachamim, arashtich li be'emunah, v'yadat et Adonai. Where do we say that? When do we say that? When do we say those arashtichlis? There's 3 of them. Anybody know?
Weddings?
Absolutely. A lot of times people will say this as they circle the bride. Arashtichli, I will espouse you. I will bind you together. Some people say this as they wrap tefillin. They say this, I will bind you, or I will espouse you, right? I will put you together with me. Yeah, it's a beautiful phrase. It's one of the most, actually, it's the most famous phrase of Hosea is this line, because we use it so many times. Judith asked when we read Hosea. I will show you real quickly right now some of the haftarot that we have that have the Hosea sections. Here's the first portion. We've got Hosea in. Again, this has Ashkenazi, Yemenite, Karaite traditions. There's different traditions for haftarot. We, of course, usually follow the Ashkenazi or Sephardic. But you can see Vayetze, which we read during Genesis. We read that a few weeks ago. The next one we've got coming up is Hosea. There's one in, I know there's one in, well, that's Korach, but we do Samuel. Here we've got, wait, I skipped some. There's some, oh, here. Oh, no, that's, no, here, Bamidbar. At the beginning of, read this chapter that we're reading right now, Hosea. So there's Hosea. So, yeah, Hosea is in the Haftarot, but this one in particular, when we read Numbers, we read this section we just read. Beautiful section. It's so beautiful that this crazy dude that has to marry a prostitute, his words end up becoming the words we say at every wedding. Well, not every wedding, but we used to. Not everybody does circling anymore. Some people do it, some people don't. I'd say less than 50% do circling, maybe 50%. Yeah, a lot of people, not Chabad. I always give people the option of doing it. Some people do it 7 times, some people do it 3 times. You do it 3 times, this works out perfectly. Some people do it once, some people do it 3 and 1. Do that one a lot. It's like one of the last times I did it, we did it 3 for the woman, 3 for the guy, and then 1 where they walk around each other. So yeah, this is when we do it. But it's pretty weird if you think about it, that sometimes it hits me that if they only knew where this section came from, if they only knew that this was a guy who married wow. But it's beautiful. It's a beautiful phrase. It's how much more beautiful can you? I espouse you to forever. I espouse you with, I will be bound to you with, together with righteousness and justice and goodness and mercy. I mean, it's beautiful. And then be'emunah and knowledge. I mean, they translate Yadat Adonai, devoted to God, but it's literally, of course, Mary, what does yours translation says? And know the Lord, right? You should know the Lord, that you should have knowledge or cognizance or dot of Adonai. So it's beautiful.
In that day I will respond, declares God. I will respond to the sky, and it shall respond to the earth. And the earth shall respond with new grain and wine and oil, and they shall respond to Jezreel. I will sow her in the land as my own, and take Lo Ruhamah back in favor. And I will say to Lo Ami, you are my people. And he will respond, you are my God.
Beautiful. So the kids, their names turn out to be okay because they are not Lo Ruhamah anymore. They are Rachem. They are going to have. I mean, this is a horrible translation. I just want to put out because it should at some point tell you, I will sow in her land as my own, right? And it says right here, Richamti et Lo Ruhamah. I will mercifully take back Lo Ruhamah. That's probably King James got to say the word mercy in there, don't they? See, it's a horrible translation. What does yours say? All right. And I will take Rehumah back, Lo Ruhamah back in mercy. Yeah, that's even better. I will, well, actually, that's not because the whole play on it, it doesn't have Lo Ruhamah in quotes, huh? I mean, or in capitalization. See, that King James didn't do a good thing there then, because they didn't indicate that this is her name, right? This is her name. Lo Ruhamah was her name. Lo Ami was his name. If you don't translate that, then you're missing the point of the kids get vindicated in the end. Their names turn out to be names of hope because there is mercy, there is pity, there is a nation that is God's. God says, you're my people, Ami ata, to the Lo Ami. So you have to have, I mean, both of those translations are bad because neither one of them fully convey the fact that the Hebrew is a play on those names. So both, you need to translate it, and you also need to use the word that was used in the name. So that's the way that there's vindication here. So we're going to finish here today with chapter 3. And this is, I don't know what to tell you. Let's read it, and then you'll tell me.
God said to me further, go, befriend a woman who, while befriended by a companion, consorts with others, just as God befriends the Israelites, but they turn to other gods and love the cups of a grape.
Now, it does not say befriend. It says, Mary. Yeah, the word right here is ahav. Chav isha. Ahuvat. That she loves. Well, it's actually, it's not, it's a horrible translation. What is yours? What is your first line there say, Mary?
Then said the Lord unto me, go yet, love a woman, be beloved of her friend, yet an adulteress according to the love of the Lord.
Yeah. Is this a different woman? Is this the same woman? Is this a different woman? Did something happen to the first
Is it-
woman?
Or is it just a different version of the story?
Correct. Or is it a different version of the same story? It's just doesn't really tell us, which is why we have all different possibilities that the other woman died, that there's a new woman that he's got to. I mean, the problem is it doesn't really tell us. Well, let's read chapter 3 and then we will see, because it's so weird after reading chapter 2 and reading what we thought was a version of incident, maybe imagine, but maybe not. And is this the same thing? I don't know. So here's what it says.
Then I hired her for 15 shekels of silver, a homer of barley, and a latak of barley. And I stipulated with her, in return, you are to go a long time without either fornicating or marrying, even though I shall not cohabit with you.
Or again, or even I shall not. Yeah. So
Even I shall,
I'm not
okay,
gonna,
no, didn't get it
I'm
there.
not gonna sleep with you. And you're not gonna sleep with anybody for a while. Okay. I get that. That's the way you're making sure that, that uh calm down period. But what's weird about this is that he paid for her. I hired her, purchased her. I mean, those are all possibilities from the translations akira. I purchased her. So this one does not seem to be just a marriage or there's a monetary thing that happens here in order for them to even be together. Which has led some people to say that if it's the same woman, if it's Gomer, that she wound up being owned by somebody. I mean, I don't know, but people who read this, and it's in the next chapter, Jewish commentators, Christian commentators, lots of commentators have said it's the same woman and she's now owned by somebody else. I don't know. To me, it doesn't really make sense, but that's the way a lot of people have seen this. Not everybody. A lot of people don't, but there are people who say it's the same woman, which is why. Oh, wait, what happened to it? Do it right now. For those.
Gomer Pyle. knows-
Gomer Pyle? Yeah.
Gomer Pyle knows what his
Yeah.
name is.
Gomer is not in this case,
15 shekels is pretty expensive, isn't it?
it's about half of a eligible slave, whatever, a male slave. This is the picture that I
Mhm.
put up at the beginning. This is him buying her, which I don't know. It's definitely not a Jewish artist did this, but I only say that because this looks like it was the cover of some romance novel or something. I don't know, but I thought it was kind of. Yeah, I know. But
Well, so around Nan's novel, there'd be more chest.
yes, but you can see there's it's a Christian romance novel. But you can see there's a little cash being exchanged right there, right? He's buying her. So
He
is it?
looks pretty happy to get the cash instead of the girl.
Yeah, I know. But did this Gomer wind up being owned by another guy? I don't know, but this is what we have. So let's keep going.
And I stipulated with her, in return, you are to go a long time. All right.
Oh, yeah, you read that. Yeah.
For the Israelites shall go a long time without king and without officials, without sacrifice and without cult pillars and without ephod and oracle idols. Afterward, the Israelites will turn back and will seek the eternal their God and David their king, and they will thrill over God and over God's bounty in the days to come.
Yeah, so we don't really have to figure out what the period of abstinence is about. It's about the time that Israel will be not doing any gods, any temples, any religion, any political power. They're going to be without lots of stuff, but then they're going to come back in full force. And then they'll be really excited to come back and notice what it says, to come back to King David. So this guy, even though he lives in the north, is looking for a united kingdom. He's looking for a kingdom where there is no north and south. There's only one kingdom. There's only one place, maybe. Now, we haven't really gotten into it yet. So I'm jumping the gun a little bit by telling you about the place. But it definitely seems like, at least with the king, they're back to Jerusalem. They're going to go back to Jerusalem. So, but there's going to be a waiting period. There's going to be a cooling off period. There's nothing there. And you can see that's it. That's chapter 5. Verse 5. That's it. It's the end of it. So we're getting into this chapter. With that little chapter right here, that little 5 verses, is it a mini version of that story? Is it another version of that story? Is it a different person? Is it, did it happen, did it happen in his mind? I mean, I don't know. It's very clear that this is all, again, performance art. This is for there to learn. So let's read.
Hear the word of God, O people of Israel, for God has a case against the inhabitants of this land, because there is no honesty and no goodness and no devotion to God in the land. False swearing, dishonesty and murder and theft and adultery are rife. Crime follows upon crime. For that the earth is withered. Everything that dwells on it languishes. Beasts of the field and birds of the sky, even the fish of the sea perish. Absolutely no one shall rebuke, none shall protest. For this your people has a grievance against you, O priest. So you shall stumble by day, and by night a prophet shall stumble as well, and I will destroy your kindred.
Yeah, that says priests, right? Some priest is not doing what they're supposed to be doing. It didn't say king, it said priest. And prophets too are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. Yeah.
My people
Okay.
is just
Wait, John,
Oh.
yeah.
So you shall stumble by
Wait, hold
day.
on, 1 second.
Read
Rosemary,
that,
1
right?
second. Yeah, 1 second. Yeah, John? Redundant from the other prophets.
What's the time period from Genesis 5 to?
So hundreds of years of Israel not behaving well with their own control, right? Yeah, I mean,
It's just the same thing, different story, different actor.
okay, but let's look at, yes. So obviously the most powerful things that we remember about Hosea are what he has to do in his own life. But yes, the message that we're going to get for the next few chapters is similar to what other prophets say. What's important about this is that and what's somewhat unusual about this, or surprising about this, is that this is an Israelite prophet. This is a prophet from the north who's pretty much saying what the prophets of the south have said up until now. The prophets that we've read are southern prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel is not even in the south. He's out of the country by now. He's in exile. But these are prophets this is a prophet of the north. And he's the first prophet we are encountering in the north who's telling the people what they're doing, how they're doing, what they're doing is wrong, right? So, but there's some interesting stuff that he says here too, that we haven't seen yet. Okay, we're in, yeah, so the priest right there.
Mhm.
Okay, here we go.
My people is destroyed for the lack of devotion. Because you have rejected devotion, I reject you as my priest. Because you have spurned the teaching of your God, I in turn will spurn your children. The more they increased, the more they sinned against me. I will change their dignity to dishonor. They feed on my people's purgation offerings, and so they desire its iniquity. Therefore, the people shall fare like the priests. I will punish it for its conduct. I will requite it for its deeds. Truly, they shall eat but not be sated. They shall swill but not be satisfied, because they have forsaken God to practice lechery. Wine and new wine destroy the mind of my people. It consults its stick. Its rod directs it. A lecherous impulse has made them go wrong, and they have strayed from submission to their God.
Yep. Now, again, this is a part, as I mentioned to you, where the language is a little strange and the
I
cadence.
don't know. Did he just say they're thinking with the wrong head?
Yes. But yes, and it's very powerful because he literally said, I mean, we believe that, and part of it's now because we understand that this maybe is a slightly different dialect, that he's playing off that exact image, because the word lecherous here is perhaps not the right word here, in the sense that it's probably not as directly specific as, what does the King James translate the word lechery as? Whoredom. It's the same word. Vaiznu. Right? The word zanut is used over and over again. Zanut, vayain. So there's lechery and wine. And again, notice how they're really not sure where to punctuate this, because the language of it is a slightly different structure than what we've had in, let's say, a prophet like Isaiah. But you get the understanding. And again, even though maybe it's not translated here as great as it should be, that's why I point out to you, and again, thank you, Rosemary, for pointing that out, that yes, they're basically saying that it's it's a play off of it. And I don't think lechery is giving us the full impact of it, because it's a sexual impulse. I mean, the word lecherous is obviously, like somewhat sexual, but it's not just like, I'm looking at, like, if you say the guy's lecherous, it's like, maybe he just looks at people, in a lecherous way. No, this is, they're doing whatever they want. They're having sex with whoever they want, or specifically in a sense of harlotry or whoredom, whatever you want to call it. But that's what they're doing. So it's the same phrase. It's the phrase for their sexual proclivity. It's their energy is being directed towards that. So the word in Hebrew is so much more powerful. I don't even know if you could translate it anywhere, but the word is ruach zenunim. The energy, the spirit of whoredom is in them. So yeah, I mean, you're right to some extent, Rosemary, in saying that you're thinking with their wrong head. But what's interesting about it is it's actually using the word ruach, which we almost always use for spirit, right? It's energy. And it's whoredom energy. It's whorish energy that they're using. It's not just that they're thinking like that, but they're animated by this energy for that. And it's in place of God. It's in place of the energy that they have for God.
Children who were reading this.
No kid should be reading this, right?
Oh, okay, but you did.
I probably was 12 or 13 when I read it the first time. I don't think I definitely didn't understand it. I knew what a prostitute was by the time I was 13, but I don't think anyone translated it or gave me an understanding that this was what fully going on. And again, I don't think this was not the main prophet we studied.
Pagan people believe in Baal. Their worldview is a world of chaos. Okay? Jews and monotheism, their worldview is a world of order. And I think that's what's really going on here.
Well, it's interesting you say that. Look at the next line. Read that, Rosemary.
They sacrifice on the mountaintops and offer on the hills under oaks, poplars, and terebinths, whose shade is so pleasant. That is why their daughters fornicate and their daughters-in-law commit adultery.
So there is that understanding that there's not chaos, there's a sense of lack of decorum, there's a lack of understanding of proper spaces for and again, to some extent, they're saying, look, they don't worship in a temple, they worship up on the mountains. And guess what? That's what their kids do. So they definitely felt that way. Look,
It's a clash of values. I mean, the closest analogy that I can think of in modern terms is communism versus capitalism. I mean, it's a whole different way of looking at the world that's in conflict here between monotheism and paganism. And it's been going, it's going on for like 1,000 years, 1,500 years.
I agree with you. I agree with you, Ronnie, but add one thing to this. Add one thing to this.
And-
If somebody read this in 1969, is reading this in their church in Arkansas, while kids are running around in Saugerties, New York.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the interesting way that this is played out, because, you know, as much as I agree with what you're saying, there's part of me that says, oh, these are a bunch of kids that
They're
are
making like
raised-
it's Woodstock.
Exactly. But I would say you don't even have to go, you know, we're doing it now. You know, they're at Coachella. But, you
Right.
know, it's an interesting thing because, you know, where are those boundaries where you say, look, we're going to move in these worlds. And
If the world is chaotic, boundaries are transactional. If the world is ordered by a transcendent God, then human behavior is not transactional. And that's a huge.
yeah, and I would say, yes. And I would say it also happens within, you're right, it happens in a clash of capitalistic versus totalitarian governments, but it also happens within consumeristic society.
It's Bible study.
Yep.
Critical thinking.
Yep.
So I need, Ronnie, I need you to, because I might not be the brightest bulb in the room here, but I see no nexus at all between what you just said and rather what you just kind of alluded to at all.
So Ronnie's point was that there's a difference of philosophy here between like a capitalistic and communist.
Get that analogy, because
That's
your
all.
analogy is better.
So what I said is that I don't know that it has to be between that. I think it is within our society, within Western society. So within a Western society, John, we have different approaches to relationships, and it comes from partly from our religious or theological, philosophical training, and also from the general culture around us. So if the general culture around us basically says every relationship we have, and I like the words that Ronnie uses, transactional, right? So that it's only what I get from you and what you get from me. And that's all I care about is what is happening now in this moment. Then you are kind of living like this image that Hosea just gave us, which is an image of people doing whatever they want because it makes them feel good. And because there's benefit for them in that
That
moment.
they will sacrifice to the particular God that justifies what they're doing.
Yeah.
And
So what our God demanded was a relationship based
it's
on,
not our, it's God.
yeah. So at this
Justice and mercy, like he was saying in the previous paragraph.
Yeah,
Not thinking about justice and mercy if you're just thinking about having a good time under the trees.
yes. So God, but at this time, a fraction of a this is the thing I always try to tell people. We have to remember what was really happening here, not making an excuse for our ancestors, but for Isaiah telling these people that there's nobody in the world that believes this except for us. Now we take it for granted because there's a billion and a half Christians that believe at least tangentially, somewhat, at least they have our Bible. They know what they're supposed to be doing. I know. That's why what's happening here is so crazy, is that we are trying to get through to the world this idea that there's God that actually cares about it. You know, look.
God that cares about how we treat each other.
Yeah. And
And
then the
doesn't just care about
relationship,
getting the right sacrifice at the right time.
and that's what, there seems to be a point where we started to get this. We get it during this period. When God commands us to do things in Exodus and in Numbers in the Torah, God tells us to do these things, and they're the ways that are laid out for us. At a certain point, we have to decide, and that's what the prophets are dealing with, a world that is not subscribing to that way. And so
I think it's more of a species that God created that can't handle its brevity. Animals have no problem with this.
So John is saying, for people that we as humans have a problem because of our lack of time here on this world. It's definitely a problem.
A lack of what?
Lack of time that we have in this world. Listen, the
A lack of time
justification,
in the world.
yeah, the
right.
justification, yes, so the justification for, sometimes the justification, by the way, these are two middle-aged men talking about this right now, right? Two men who are entering that time of their life where you start to think about, I don't have that much time. And is the
Try being an
justification,
old lady.
I didn't say that, Rosemary, but these are,
I said it.
these are white men who are saying, who are
Oh,
white
and I'm
men,
white too.
white men in their 50s and 60s who are saying, because of this is what you're getting to, which is that because why? Because I've thought the same thought, which is if we only have a certain amount of time, why are we trying to pay attention to what we should do to make everybody happy versus what we should do to make ourselves happy? The justification for not doing the right thing when you're at a certain stage of your life is that, what difference does it make? I don't have that much more time here anyways. I might as well do what I want to do.
You know what? I have to tell you, that's not what I was
And
thinking.
Hosea is saying you're going to wreck the world for your children.
Yes.
That's
So
not
what are you
I'm
saying?
What I'm trying to do is digest 2 years of study as the redundancy of the issues happening over and over and over again. The world doesn't get destroyed. Temples, the flood happened, but Noah created new bloodlines, right? And it just keeps going and going and going. And the guardrails that are put up with religion, right, in Judaism, right, and then also of elected or designated authority, and people still, right, are finding ways to enjoy themselves, right, and so to hold them to such strict standards is very difficult, and that's almost. And I'm not saying being adultery is acceptable; it's not ever, or drinking and driving, right, something like that. But that's what I'm having a hard time. And so when you say like capitalism and communism, that makes like zero sense to me in regards to what we're discussing.
Well,
because I think
think-
there's not debauchery happening there.
no, it's not. No, it's not that.
John,
It's not that.
it was a bad analogy. But when I use that analogy, I meant it to mean two different worldviews that compete with each other and see the world totally differently. Not that one is good and one is bad, and I don't want to superimpose all the politics on top of it. A better example is the analogy Mark used in our modern society, justifying, is the world transactional? Is it chaotic? Or is it ordered? And are we responsible to?
Why is transactional chaotic? I think that's actually quite.
No,
Transactional in the sense that there's no universal moral code. The only reason for me not to cheat on my wife is the fear of getting caught. If I'm not going to get caught, and if I'm going to benefit from it, then what the hell's wrong with it?
Because you made a contract with your spouse.
Yeah, but that's still
That's in the world of monotheism.
honor.
That's the world of monotheism, not the world of paganism. The world of paganism.
I never lived in paganism. So
no, but what we're talking about. No, but you see it. because the transactional,
Going on here.
the transactional issue happened right here in this chapter. Or the previous, he gave the guy 15 shekels and now owns a woman. So you can have that. You can have that in a society that's purely transactional. So I know what you're saying, because we use the word transactional in politics a lot. We talk about, but because the point is it can't only be transactional. You can't only have, there has to be something bigger than that transaction.
Word means different things, sends you in different directions.
That's
Same word.
That's for sure. But what we're talking about is actually that there is that there is a higher authority that actually, or a higher responsibility. I don't want to use the word authority, but a higher responsibility to something that is not just on because I can justify, like if I say, well, because people had slavery in those days. I paid for the slave. It doesn't matter. And you said, I went into a deal, I bought the slave, I own the slave, and now it's my slave. I can do whatever I want. That's
I think-
purely, that's based on the transaction.
I think what's coming from this for me is that Hosea said, or God is saying to Hosea, you know, your life has a spiritual dimension, whether you like it or not, you know, and you better make sure that, and my people better make sure that that energy is directed positively, because otherwise it becomes very destructive.
Yeah, that is definitely the point of it. But again, what we're talking about and why we got on this is because this is such a amazing imagery that he just laid on us. This connection between their behavior in life, their morality or their way that they behave in their homes is directed by the way that they worship. Because again, we don't have that. We haven't seen that a lot. What Hosea, and this is why Hosea is, like, as I said, the prophet of love, the prophet of relationships, because he's actually bringing it home. He's actually saying, what is the consequence of behaving like a Canaanite? It's that that's what
Now, your
happens when
children are going to behave the way you do.
yeah.
Now, don't go have an orgy on the hill and then complain because your daughters are
family's having an
acting out.
orgy at home. Yes.
At this time, with the priests or rabbis.
These are priests, just priests.
So rabbis haven't come
Nope.
along to.
Nope.
To be.
No, but priests supposedly are telling people what they're supposed to be doing, which, by the way, he said that they're not. He actually just said the priests are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're not doing their job. It says right here, I reject you as my priest because you've spurned the teaching of your God. It's the word right there. It was Torah, right? The Torah, God's Torah.
So the folks have no guardrails. Because the priests have not.
Yes, the priests are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. We will.
That's hundreds of years after Joseph was thrown into prison.
Yes.
1,000 years after.
It's 600 years
So
after.
yeah. Did the laws just disintegrate?
No, people have decided, the people in the north in his neighborhood have decided that it's more important to do this, to behave like this, than to be following God. What's interesting is that, again, he's a northern prophet. This isn't the idea that this were like this, the northerners didn't know what they were supposed to do or didn't have voices that were telling them what to do. Clearly Hosea was. And so what's important about Hosea is that as a northern prophet telling people, no, there's a consequence. I mean, we knew Elijah was doing it, but we never really hear Elijah. We don't get Elijah's prophecies. We don't get Elijah's words. We don't get exactly what we get what God tells Elijah. We get Elijah running around doing amazing stuff, doing miracles, but we don't get him speaking. We don't get him speaking on behalf of God. Here we do, though. Here we have Hosea speaking on behalf of God. So we'll pick up next week. We'll finish up chapter 4. And again, these chapters, as we go through these chapters, and again, some of them are super short. I mean, let me just show you that some of the prophets, some of the chapters coming up with Hosea are very short. We are again probably going to be reading this for 2 more weeks, and then we'll be into the next prophet. But again, some of these prophets are, some of these prophetic books are even, I mean, this is, as I said, this is a longer, comparatively longer book of the prophets. There's 197 verses here. And again, most of these chapters are, 15 to 16 verses, whereas, when we were in Ezekiel, we had chapters that were, 49, we had, 28, 38. You could see the average verse there was 26 chapters, 26 verses per chapter, and in this one it's 14. So much shorter. This is the 8th century. So these are 730s. These are,
So 5th century BC,
yes,
right?
5th century.
Democracy, not our.
200 years before Greeks, yes. 200 years before the Greeks. 200 years before the Greeks, we're having these discussions, which
So
again,
it took 200 more years before people decided we can govern ourselves outside of religious government.
the idea that the Greeks were
Whatever.
such great Democrats
No,
is also, yes,
before people started.
correct. This is
national
200
parties.
years. This is 250 years before the height of the Greek city-states.
Imagine the craziness going on.
Imagine the craziness. Imagine the craziness, because the people in Europe were 250 years away from having these kinds of, now again, the idea that every one of them were behaving in a depraved way, we don't know for sure, but we would assume that based on the archaeology, based on human behavior, that these were scary places to live.
It's funny because
Scary.
that silly movie that Brad Pitt made called Babylon, which I
Yeah.
watched, which I don't know if you've seen.
No, I didn't see it. I heard it was terrible.
It's terrible, but it dovetails right into this, right into this.
Well, yeah, that's why it's called Babylon. That's why it was called Babylon. That's why they called that Hollywood era Babylon, because people saw it as the excesses of the Babylonians, which, by the way, we came in contact with because of the exile. But what we saw was a society unlike some of these societies, but this society in particular, the Babylonians, who were wealthy and who were depraved. So for us, it was a combination of success and this moral licentiousness, where there were no rules. That's what we're fighting against today, and what we were fighting against then is how do we move between those? How do we move between those societies? How do we get the best out of Western society or Western culture that is moving further and further away from any sense of religious authority? We know that in Europe and Australia, New Zealand, much of the Western world, that people are not going to religious training anymore. They're not going to Sunday school. The biggest church in Australia was no church. 41% of Australia was listed no church as their religion. So
Even people that in America that I identify as evangelicals aren't going to church, which is totally weird to me.
it is very weird. And we noticed, by the way, too, Rosemary, that in England, and you're an Anglophile, I think, was it a couple of years ago that more people identified as Jedi than that actually went to Anglican church or something? I think I read that there were more people that identified as Jedi than Anglican at one point. Anyways, yeah, it's not funny. I mean, it's a
When we were growing up, people were leaving Brooklyn, New York, and moving to communes where all hell reigned. I mean, and there are still communes out there where people choose to live a group life.
Well, that's what I was saying, 69, Woodstock. That's a
Oh,
simple.
it was even before. Yeah, 'cause we're
So really we're going on and on, but it goes back to my point that people want to live their lives. They don't want to be confined by religious dogma per se, and within as much as they can within the governance of their elected officials.
yeah.
The laws that we create, which they can't even do that.
Yep.
Well, on that happy note.
Well, no, I will tell you, by the way, just to make sure that you know this is actually true. I don't know that people are actually worshiping as Jedi, but in England, almost 390,000 people stated their religion as Jedi on the 2001 census. But it passed Sikhism, Judaism, and Buddhism is the fourth largest reported religion in the country. So, yeah, 2.6% of Brighton claimed to be Jedi, but they were not liable for, yeah, they did it as somewhat of a joke, but the point is that, yeah.
When they start levitating things, I'll be impressed.
All right, folks, we'll. All right, so for next week, we'll see you next week as we finish up. And remember, tomorrow night we are on, but we're virtual for Wednesday night for Pirkei Avot. So we'll see you in the coming days, and be well, everybody. Thank you, Rosemary. I'll see
Thank
later.
you. Bye, everybody.
Oh, eat for
Thank
TBA
you.
tonight. Eat for TBA tonight. Thank you, John.
Judith, drive out here.
Slater's 50-50. What's the 50 for?
The 50.